Novelist, historian, political philosopher, C.L.R. James has shaped 4 generations of Caribbean and global thinkers and activists. A new biography of this Caribbean icon explores the connections between his restless life and his wide-ranging work, a chance to consider what James means for us today. Now, biographer John L. Williams joins scholar Aaron Kamugisha for a conversation about James the writer and James the man, part of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest's 4 Days to Change the World.
Good evening. I am glad to be here on the opening night of the NGC Bocas Lit Fest. My name is Aaron Kamugisha, and I am joined here by John Williams, who has done a remarkable new biography of C.L.R. James called C.L.R. James, A Life Beyond the Boundaries. And I'd like to say, first of all, on behalf of NGC Bocas and everyone who's out there, welcome, John.
I'm really pleased to be here virtually. I only wish I was there in person, but yeah, you can't have everything.
Indeed, indeed. Yes. So let's get started with a question which you actually bring up in towards the very end of the biography. And that's the basic question of how you met James or how you first encountered James, his work, James the man, and the pathway that led you towards actually writing this biography.
Okay, well, I was in my early 20s. I was, a typical. I wasn't a student at that point. I'd been working in a anarchist printers in Cardiff, and with older people who'd read a lot of politics. And one of the names, they threw all these names at me, most of which went straight over my head. But one of them was C.L.R. James. And then I was watching a TV documentary about the Jamaican poet Mikey Smith, and in the middle of this documentary, he and Linton Kwesi Johnson go to meet this old guy upstairs in some house in Brixton and start talking to him about, well, they want to talk about dub poetry, and he starts schooling them in kind of Shakespeare and Wordsworth. And I'm thinking, who is this kind of grey-haired sage, And it turns out it's this C.L.R. James guy that I've vaguely heard of. And I thought, well, I've really never seen anyone like that on my TV in Britain before. And so I went out and I read Black Jacobins, which completely, was a history that was so unfamiliar to me at that point. And, the way it centered kind of black resistance rather than kind of black oppression was great. It was just so inspiring to read. And then I was also a big cricket fan, and someone told me, he also wrote a book about cricket. I don't think they were sure that was a good idea, but I kind of sought that out. And when I read Beyond the Boundary, it completely, the way it showed the way in which, Britain had changed people in the Caribbean, but the Caribbean had changed Britain. Cricket, this most English of games, had been completely changed by being exported to the Caribbean. And by the time it came back to Britain, it was something else again. And this, I just thought, it just obviously doesn't just apply to cricket, it applied to everything of how the world is post-colonialism and how we change each other. And I just, it just made me both rethink everything I knew. And I just found it really inspiring. And I was, from that point on, just, a James fan, if you like. And it started there. I read more of his stuff over the years, and eventually I got to an age where I have written a few biographies. And I was looking at the books there were on him, and there's lots of really interesting theoretical work about him, but nothing that really told you the story of his life. And looking at the dates alone, 1901 to 1989, it's what you think that's a hell of a life. So much must have happened. And I felt old enough and stupid enough to think, let's try and tell that story. So that's basically it.
Which actually goes on to the second question I was going to ask. With all that has been written on James, I would think that from my vague analysis, there are at least 12 single authored books, probably another 10 or so edited collections, and that's besides the huge number of essays, the different ways in which James has been taken up. I mean, James is one of the great world thinkers of the 20th century. I was going to ask you, why then another book on James? Why another book on James right now? But I'm getting the idea that you thought that there was something biographical that had been missed, that most of the ways in which James had been taken up had been through the lens of scholarly study, while you wanted to actually bring a more human side, perhaps, to James, or a different type of side, perhaps.
Yeah,
Say
yeah,
more.
exactly that. I mean, you know, within the academy, James is a huge figure, and he's like an area of study in his own right. And yet outside of the academy, he gets reduced to a stereotype, I guess. He's some kind of wise old black power guy or something. I feel there's no subtlety and depth to to people's understanding of James outside of the academy. And also, I just I'm fascinated by people, really. I mean, in a way, more than I'm not really an ideological thinker. I'm fascinated by the realities of people's lives, what they do, how they do it. And I felt that, that in the case of James, there had to be so much there. It just had to be an interesting life. And then I started work on it, and you think, gosh, the places he went, the ways he changed himself over the years, from being a literary young man in Trinidad to being a Trotskyist in the north of England, to being to almost completely reinventing Marxism in New York in the 40s and 50s, and then coming back home to Trinidad and trying to work with Eric Williams at the beginning of independence. There's just so rich, really, and so full of human drama. There's love affairs, there's car crashes, there's a whole mass of stuff. And I just wanted James, if you liked, there's fun in James, there's humor in James, and the academy is great, but you also I wanted to write a book that I hope will make people who aren't in the academy read about it and think, God, what an incredible life, and make them think, and then actually go and read some James, because that's the point, I guess.
Well, certainly. And as someone who's read and researched a great deal on James, I was absolutely fascinated at the level of detail, including the personal detail that you managed to mine for your book. And I was wondering if you wish to discuss this with us further, and on two levels. One, the question of the interviews you conducted, and secondly, on the question of the archives. And we can leave the archives for now, and I could just basically ask you about the actual interviews that you conducted.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, he's been dead 30 years, so most of the people I spoke to, knew him in later life and knew a particular version of James, which was the teacher more than the writer, and almost the legend, if you like. He would hold court in Brixton in his last years, and people would come and sort of pay homage. And that's a very particular sense of James. It was hard to find people who went back that much further, but with a bit of work, for instance, his niece and nephew, Erica and Henno, his brother Eric's children, are in Brooklyn, and I went to talk to them, which gave me great insight into how what the family was like. They talk about how formal and Victorian they were in the going to their grandfather's house in the 50s. It was really like stepping back into a previous age of kind of Victorian gentility. So it was amazing to meet them. And then there were people. I met one of his Trotskyist group in New York, the Johnson Forest Tendency. I found a woman called Isa K. Mexin, in her 90s, who still had, very clear and actually in her case, perhaps slightly troubling memories of James and so on. Yeah, it kept. I mean, in a way, also in the last years, you had a complex living situation where he was essentially looked after by the Race Today organization, particularly by Darcus Howe and his wife Leila Hassan Howe. But he also had a secretary, Anna Grimshaw, who was a kind of middle-class white woman. And, you see, in that instance, people had very different memories of what of who he was, if you like. You realize that it's a bit of a cliche about James that everyone has their own CLR James, and that's normally applies to people who read CLR James and take some particular message from his work. But it also really applies to people who knew him, that, you know, there were so many sides to the man that, you know, one person would see one side and the same person the next day would see a different side. So it's, and as a biography, you have to try and pull that together and try and, you know, find a way through that shows as much as you ever can the whole, you know, richness and roundness of the man.
Indeed, indeed, very much so. And as you said, it's a very long journey from 1901 to 1989, and it begins in colonial Trinidad. And I was thinking that this might be a good time for us to go to one of your readings. I believe you have a reading prepared for us, which is on that particular period that I'm sure viewers would love to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. It's not about his childhood, which is so brilliantly covered in Beyond the Boundary, which people, you know, perhaps more likely to be familiar with, where he talks about growing up and particularly about cricket. But I'm going to take us to his early 20s when he's teaching at QRC and just, you know, starting to make his way in the world. And in particular, okay, I'll just take it from there. While his interest in cricket has come to be the best known aspect of CLR's life and character, it did not define how he thought about himself at the time. He illustrates the sport's significant but minor place in his pantheon by listing all the English magazines he subscribed to at the time. A list that also gives a marvellous picture of the young Caribbean intellectual. Not only the Cricketer, but the Times Literary Supplement, the Times Educational Supplement, the Observer, the Sunday Times, the Criterion, the London Mercury, the Musical Review, the Gramophone, the editions of the Evening Standard when Arnold Bennett wrote in it, and the Daily Telegraph with Rebecca West. Not content with that list, he also added from France, the Nouvelle Revue Française and the Mercure de France, and from the USA, the Nation and the New Republic. He presumably didn't pay for all of these, but read them at the public library, where his lifelong friend Carlton Commer would order in whatever publications his peers wanted to read. Gradually, CLR began to make friends with other young men of similarly intellectual bent. First and most important of these was a Portuguese Creole called Alfred Mendes. Years later, CLR said that, if I have to single out a single individual in the Caribbean with whom my life was inextricably bound, then Alfred Mendes is the person. Much later, he summed up the mutually beneficent nature of their relationship neatly. I can't say how much I owe to Mendes. All I can say is he probably owes as much to me. Alfie Mendes was only 4 years older than CLR, but by the time they met in the early 20s, he had already had an extremely eventful life. His father was a wealthy man, having made good in the provisions business. Following his mother's death, Alfie was sent to an English boarding school for a couple of years before the outbreak of war led to his recall to Trinidad. In 1915, though, he joined the merchants contingent and went off to Europe to fight. He spent 2 years in Flanders as a rifleman, a bona fide war hero who won the Military Cross after one particular operation of foolhardy bravery. He was finally invalided out after inhaling poison gas. His wartime experiences provided the inspiration for his grandson Sam Mendes' film 1917, a century later. Back in Trinidad, Alfie met his first wife, Jessie. They married, had a son, and Jessie died of pneumonia, all within 2 years. In 1922, he married his second wife, Juanita. Meanwhile, he was working for his father and starting to write. In a society as compact as Port of Spain, it was inevitable that two young men of letters like Alfie Mendes and CLR James would meet. CLR made an immediate impression. He stood about 6 feet 3 inches, as lean as a pole, and possessed the kind of rough charm that women of all complexions succumb to so easily. His intelligence was of the highest order, his memory for music and literature phenomenal. All of this was seasoned with a sharp wit and a sardonic sense of humour. Mendes noted that while CLR was very clearly a Negro, he always assured me that one of his forebears was a European, French as my memory serves me. He also observes that as a teacher at QRC, CLR was immensely popular, teaching English and history with a style so austere and at the same time so colourful that his pupils listened to him in thrall. It's an observation that suggests that the key elements of CLR's speaking style were in place well before he ever left Trinidad. For his part, CLR was simply delighted to meet someone as fanatical in their love of literature as himself. He was particularly impressed that Alfie Mendez had his own library. His father had bought in the house at 45 Richmond Street when he married, and he had since added on an extra room to house his library, which already ran to more than 2,000 volumes, mostly novels and poetry. The two men started to meet regularly. After he finished teaching, CLR would cycle down to the Mendez business premises, and together the two friends would head back to Alfie's house and settle down in his study. Countless of the hours I spent there, CLR later recalled. Together they would read the literary periodicals, order the books they read about, and then discuss them. Mendez, being the son of a wealthy father, he bought more books than I did, but I don't think there was any great gap between us. Indeed not. CLR's healthy salary enabled him to start on a prodigious book-buying habit, one that would carry on throughout his life, even at times when he was living in the most straitened of circumstances. When it came to assessing life's essentials, books always came first for him. Mendez and James's friendship saw them exchanging letters on a daily basis, despite the fact they saw each other most days and lived in the same town. Few of their letters survive, but a sprinkling of those written by CLR give the flavour of their friendship. They address each other by their surnames as per the public school code. The earliest surviving letter dates from December 1925 and begins, "Dear Mendez, I return the 2 books I borrowed last evening," before going on to discuss Thomas Hardy's The Dynasts. CLR comments that, "Unfortunately, I have neither the time nor the energy just yet to give a book like that the attention it deserves. Reading such a book is a landmark in one's literary life, and I'd like to see a few days clear before me." CLR's letter also asks for feedback on something he's written. "How do you like my sketch? It's rather annoying of me, I admit, but I'd like to hear your opinion on what I have written. You know how isolated you can feel in this God-forsaken hole." Further letters see him sending Mendez volumes of Chekhov stories and a work by the Austrian Schnitzler. Gramophone records, an exciting new phenomenon, are exchanged too. CLR had a gramophone in his room. Mostly they swapped classical music, Beethoven, Brahms, Debussy, etc., though on one occasion CLR has to apologise for not sending back a recording of Gershwin's Rhapsody in Blue because a lady borrowed it. This is about as forthcoming as CLR ever was in referring to his many relationships with women. His published writings, when they touch on the matter of sex at all, tend to see him presenting himself as an upright Puritan, a prisoner of the strict moral code of his upbringing. The truth was generally a long way from that. As Alfie Mendez suggests in his pen portrait, CLR spent a lot of energy in the pursuit of women and continued to do so throughout his life. And if you want to know more about that, you'll have to read the book.
Indeed, thank you very much. And that takes us straight on to the other part of my earlier question, and that has to do with the archives. Now, there are major James archives in Trinidad at the University of the West Indies St. Augustine campus. It's a very major James archive there. There's also a collection of papers at Columbia University that contains some very important work. There's also the Wayne State Archive, which I believe has Martin Glaberman, a close associate of James and Johnson Forrest's tendency. And I believe that contains a lot of the papers of Glaberman. I believe also Grace Lee Boggs' papers may also be there. So those are the 3 major archives that most Jamesian knows. I was amazed at the extent of the research that you managed to do, the letters, the various things that you managed to pull up that most scholars have not really engaged with before. I was wondering if you could reflect a bit on the archives that you use, the relative merits of the archives, what you found the most compelling for the story that you were trying to craft, and something also about the time period across which you collected this work.
Okay, yeah. As you say, those are the 3 main archives. There are other smaller archives that I use, but let's keep to the big 3, if you like.
Oh, we want to hear about those ones, smaller ones.
Well, we'll start with the big 3. I spend a week in the Columbia archives, which are huge, and I've box after box after box, and all the time you're guessing, because you can't. Literally, a week was not enough to see everything. So you're continually hoping you're picking out the right boxes and the right files within the right boxes. But there's a lot covering the whole life in Columbia. One thing that's different. There are probably more photos and tapes and so forth in Colombia, and there's a lot of stuff I'd love to, had I had time and money, I'd love to have listened to a lot of the tapes, but you can't do everything. Yui in Trinidad was again a huge archive that spans the whole life. There's so much there. I spent a week there, just getting there the second it opened, leaving when they finally kicked me out, and and very much the same thing. I mean, I think I knew those two were going to be great. The one that surprised me was Wayne State. I wasn't sure whether there was going to be very much there at all. But the Martin Glaberman archive is an absolute goldmine, because Glaberman kept all the correspondence between the Trotskyist group, the Johnson Forrest group, over sort of a 30-year period. And within that, there are, and also the linked archive belonging to Lyman and Freddie Payne. And particularly the letters to Lyman and Freddie Payne, are much more personal than a lot of CLR's. A lot of these letters, you've never seen anything like them. They're like bigger than A4, and they're not even single spaced. They're like half spaced. They're just, it's cramming in so many. One piece of paper will probably have 3,000 words on it. They're incredibly hard to read, and I was destroying what was left of my eyesight, speed reading these things. Photograph, if in doubt, take a photo. So I was, thank God for the camera phone and how good they are these days, because I was just going click, 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 click. But yeah, the letters to the Paynes in particular, CLR really opens up for someone like me who's trying to find out what he was doing in his life apart from writing books. Those letters were invaluable. So I think I got an immense amount. Again, it was a full week in Wayne State. Yeah, those are the big three. I mean, there's Constance Webb's letters in the Schomburg in New York. There was there's some more stuff on the Trotskyist stuff in that NYU. In London, the Senate House is quite a good Caribbean collection, which had some interesting letters, particularly with Norman Manley, who and CLR's friendship with Norman Manley is a great little story in itself, really. And it's one of the, you could probably write, if not a book, quite a slim book about that friendship. There's so much to unpack in it. There's an archive in Fullerton in California, which no one else seemed to know about. Someone in the 70s had gone and interviewed a whole lot of CLR associates, including a mysterious fellow whose name called Willie Gorman, who CLR thought was the most brilliant of his protégés, but was also an extremely troubled individual. And I'd never heard Willie Gorman speak, but there's a tape of him conducted in a park for some reason, and it sounds like he's kind of undercover. But that was a little surprise extra. And of course, down in San Fernando, there's the oil workers have got a nice archive of CLR's letters from the year or so he spent there at the beginning of the 80s. And one lovely thing there is they've got his book collection with just the books he had acquired, essentially, I think, while he was there. And again, it's a wonderful mix of everything from Proust to Lenin to Freud, and his correspondence from that time, when on a personal level, you can see that he's writing a lot. He's finished teaching. He'd been teaching in Washington, D.C. for the previous decade. And he was clearly missing that interaction with people. So many he's writing long letters to students all the time, full of just, care, talking about people's living situations. He's offering kind of grandfatherly advice to all these students, which is, again, a side of CLR I'd never have come across, really, if I hadn't gone down to San Fernando. Yeah, that'll do.
Oh, no, that's incredible. And all of this investigation, this work in the archive, it took place over what period of time? I'm trying to get a sense of the amount of time you spent researching the book and then compiling this all together. And especially since you've written a number of biographies, I was wondering a little more if you could tell us about that process of creation of the biography and the writing of the biography, which I think everyone will find very interesting and compelling to hear.
Okay, well, I mean, the short answer to the research period is probably 2 years. I mean, not non-stop, but there was about 2 years spent essentially assembling things that, you know, I start with the written sources. So everything, every book I could get, I bought or borrowed from the library and read. And next was the active research. I interviewed as many people as I could. Then I went to the archives. I think that was the next stage, partly because I had to raise funding to do that, as obviously it's expensive spending time in, the States and Trinidad. But got that together, and I think I ended up spending a month in the States and a week in Trinidad. I wish I'd had longer, but such is life. And I got in just before COVID, which was a miracle. And at that point, well, two things happened. First, I had everything, really. I felt I had everything I needed. I'd come back with literally thousands of photos of documents from the various libraries, and at the same time, lockdown came in, and I was worrying at this point. I was thinking, I've spent too long on the research. I'm never going to get this thing written. But lockdown, one thing lockdown's a blessing for is biographers with a deadline, because while everyone else is, sat indoors thinking they wish they could go out, I'm sat indoors living somebody else's life. So, I'm moving from Trinidad in 1900 to, Britain in the 30s, to the Caribbean and back and forth. And it was a fantastic way to spend lockdown. But really what I do is, I've read is to start at the beginning, really. Go back to the beginning of his life, read everything I can find that relates to like the first 10 years, and then write that part. And at that point, and repeat with his teens, his 20s and 30s and so forth, as much as possible, to try and identify with how he would have been feeling at each time, not using too much hindsight, trying to think, well, at this point, when he leaves Trinidad age 30, this is what he knows, this is the kind of person he is. So now and trying as much as you can, I've also written fiction, which may or may not be helpful. I'm quite used to the idea of putting yourself in someone else's head. And in a way, that's what I've tried is, as respectfully as I can, to think, if I were in that situation, why is he doing this now? And I think, well, this is probably why. One thing I would say that I think maybe people miss about C.L.R. James's life and his books is that he never had any money, because he never had, he didn't have an academic career. He didn't even have a degree. He was entirely a freelancer. And as someone who's also been a freelancer essentially since they were in their early 20s, I kind of know that feeling that, that you're writing, but things get written or don't get written depending on whether there's actually any money coming in that week. And I think, there are projects that you wonder, why did he abandon this project or that project? And the answer is actually pretty simple, because he needed to do something else to earn the money. So to that degree, I feel like I was able to bring something of my own experience of the writing life to a story of somebody else's writing life.
Okay, thank you. And in many ways, James is known, perhaps sometimes most widely, as one of the greatest Marxist theoreticians of the 20th century. And his meeting with Trotsky is one of the many remarkable parts of the book that people are aware of, but often they don't know the human story behind it. So I was wondering if you wanted to give us a reading on that meeting with Trotsky in Mexico in the late 1930s.
Yeah, absolutely. The meeting with Trotsky had been loosely set up for early April, but was put in jeopardy as CLR's time on the road had led him to a physical collapse. Word of this reached Trotsky himself, who wrote to offer his advice. It is my opinion you should devote the next months exclusively to the care of your health, if necessary even postponing the projected book on the Negro question. As I understand it, you suffer from a stomach ulcer. In this condition, your trip to Mexico represents, I say it with the deepest regret, a direct danger. Everyone, even those who have sound stomachs, suffer from stomach trouble here, and those who have it abroad suffer doubly and triply in Mexico City. I know it from my own experience. Your ideas for the Negro organization and the Negro paper are very interesting and important, but the first condition is the re-establishment of your health. I love the whole idea of Trotsky dealing out health advice. CLR, though, was not going to let a stomach ulcer stand between him and the opportunity to meet his political hero, and he set out for Mexico. A Spanish-speaking comrade called Charles Curtis was on hand to escort CLR to meet the old man, as his followers called him, on the 4th of April 1939. Trotsky was living in the Mexico City suburb of, I'm going to pronounce this horribly, Coyoacan, in La Casa Azul, Frida Kahlo's home since childhood. It had been turned into a fortress due to the very real threat of assassination by agents of Moscow. Inside the fortress there was a further line of defense composed of Trotsky's devoted and unflinching revolutionary followers. By the time CLR arrived, however, it was also a household in some turmoil. Trotsky and his wife Natalia were in the midst of moving out. Frida Kahlo and her husband Diego Rivera had been Trotsky's main sponsors on his arrival to seek asylum in Mexico in January 1937. But it had become a complex relationship. Trotsky and Kahlo soon embarked on an affair. She called him Piochitas, little goatee, referring to his white beard, or less affectionately, El Viejo, as he was twice her age at the time, 57 years to her 29. Ironic, too, given that Trotsky's nickname to his admirers was the Old Man. Oddly, it wasn't the affair that caused the Trotskys to move out. It had come to an end when their respective spouses discovered it. It wasn't even Frida Kahlo giving Trotsky a self-portrait for his birthday and him hanging it above his desk in the study. Instead, it was Rivera and Kahlo's move towards Stalinism. That was a betrayal that could not be ignored. Given the circumstances, it's remarkable how focused Trotsky was in his discussions with his latest visitor. But then Trotsky's life had been lived in extraordinary circumstances for decades, and while the threat of assassination was real, it was hardly new. CLR was very struck by finally meeting Trotsky. This man, whose writing had transformed him from would-be bourgeois novelist to ardent revolutionary, turned out to be something of a surprise. His manner and style were those of a European nobleman of the 19th century. There was nothing proletarian or Bolshevik in the crude sense about him at all. Furthermore, he had a great gift of languages. He would speak in English if necessary. When he was in trouble for a word, he would use the French word, pick up the English word. His wife was very handsome, very gay, very stylish, and the whole household worked extremely well, centering around him and his activity. They were a really striking pair and very different to what I'd expected a leader of the Russian Revolution to be. The two men spent several days together, debating in particular the Negro question. Trotsky was already convinced that this was an area in which the SWP were failing to make headway. CLR had prepared well, writing a document detailing his thoughts on the matter. It's a remarkable piece of work, coming from a man who'd been in the US barely 6 months. He'd evidently spent his time in Harlem productively, getting to understand the Black American mindset, one very different from that of the Black Trinidadian, let alone the Black Africans he'd met in London. Black Trinidadians like CLR had grown up under the colonial yoke, but they lived in a majority Black culture without formal segregation. Black Americans, on the other hand, in many ways felt themselves to be an oppressed nation within a nation. The successful Black protest movement had capitalized on that feeling. Marcus Garvey had offered a crude Black nationalism with a promised land over the ocean. The white radical left only offered sympathy and the promise that if you join and help make a socialist revolution, then you will be free. Black and white, unite and fight was a slogan leftists liked, but in practice, Black Americans weren't listening. CLR had thought hard about this and formed a radical plan. He argued that Black Americans, thanks to the oppression they faced, represented potentially the most revolutionary section of the population. He didn't believe that Black Americans would happily join a white socialist organization, however noble its aims. Black Americans needed a Black-led movement, one that would work alongside the SWP, but couldn't simply be a puppet body controlled by senior white theoreticians. This was a brave submission. Trotsky and Lenin before him believed in the key role of the vanguard party. The masses needed clear-eyed leadership from above to take them to the socialist uplands, in which they would in time come to political maturity. To offer a section of the proletariat, in this case black Americans, this degree of self-determination was frankly unheard of. Much to his surprise, though, CLR found the old man to be in almost complete agreement. Trotsky accepted the idea. We discussed it for 3 or 4 days, and there was very little difference between him and me. We ended with the idea that the thing we had to do was to urge and in every way do what we can to create a black movement that would fight for its democratic rights. Yeah, I mean, it's amazing how confident he was to go to have this kind of debate with, the great worldwide leader of revolutionary communism.
Certainly. And I think that James would say later in his life that he thought that his American years from 1938 to 1953 were his most productive years. And certainly that there is a huge amount of work, editorials and various articles that he published under the pseudonym J.R. Johnson and various other pseudonyms at that period of time. And of course, his very great work, Notes on Dialectics, which he later would say in a 1980 interview when he was asked what was his most important work, he said Notes on Dialectics. Now, many of us who are James scholars and Caribbeanists would demur a bit because we tend to think that the rival merits of Beyond the Boundary and the Black Jacobins are some of his principal and most important work. And certainly what he achieves in England in those 6 years he's there from 1932 to 1938, he manages to work and write and produce at an astonishing pace. However, really, in many ways, for persons in the Caribbean and in Trinidad, it's James's sojourn back into Trinidad when he returns to Trinidad after 26 years abroad in 1958 that still evokes a particular memory of James's actual presence within the region. And I'm hoping that perhaps you could give us another excerpt on that particular period, which many of us find so compelling in terms of his battles with Williams and what he's trying to craft for Trinidad and the Caribbean about a new society emerging out of colonialism. So yes, if you could give us a reading on that, I think that we would be most obliged.
Great. I may have to lead into this a bit because the reading I've got is more about his being reunited with his family. I mean, there's a couple of things I'd like to say, maybe though, about the return to Trinidad.
Well, certainly, yes.
Yeah. Because he was invited effectively by Eric Williams, and quickly Williams, because he had been Williams's teacher at QRC, they had been friends in London and in the States. I mean, to the extent that when CLR's son was born, CLR's wife Constance, at the birth, Eric Williams was holding one hand and CLR James her other hand, so they were that close. Bill, he used to call him, and. And a lot of, James's ideas are present in Williams's early work in Capitalism and Slavery. CLR James had a big influence on helping Williams shape that book, and the idea of the Woodford Square open meetings were, I think, clearly inspired by James's increasing fascination with ancient Athens and the way that democracy had worked in ancient Athens, with people talking in the marketplace. And so at the point James returns to Trinidad to help Williams, there's, I think, a great interest in this man, this, if you like, this eminence grise, who people, they knew the name, but he'd been underground in the States for so long that, it was a long time since there'd been a book. So people had a sense he was some kind of revolutionary, but they were very curious to find out, what the man was like. And at the same time, CLR, for his part, was very curious to find out what it would be like, coming home after so long. So I'll read you something about that. There's a newspaper photo of CLR James on his arrival at Trinidad's Piarco airport. It was the first time in a long while the press had taken sufficient interest in any of his doings to send a photographer. There are 3 men in the picture. The tall CLR is flanked by 2 shorter figures, his brother Eric and his old friend, the library chief, Carlton Comer. CLR himself looks thin but animated in a light-coloured suit and his Royal Deluxe Stetson. The reason for the interest was essentially curiosity. The vast majority of Trinidadians knew nothing of C.L.R. James. Those who knew most about him were his contemporaries, for whom he was an enigma. The brightest boy in Trinidad, who had belatedly gone to London and published books, as he was destined to, but had then all but vanished. There were rumours as to what had happened. He'd gone to America. He was a communist, an outlaw. The rumours weren't the reason for the newspaper photographer, though. The important thing wasn't that CLR had returned home after a quarter of a century. It was the matter of the man who'd invited him back. He'd come at the invitation of the new chief minister, Eric Williams, aka the Doctor, the man who was going to lead Trinidad to independence. Word had it that C.L.R. James had taught the Doctor at QRC. Apparently, it helped him with his big book, Capitalism and Slavery. It was the eminence grise come home to advise his protege. So that's why the photographer was there, to see what an eminence grise looked like. C.L.R. had arrived with plenty of plans to talk to Eric Williams about, but he wanted to start by seeing his family for the first time in decades. His brother was the only exception. They'd met up a few times in the 50s in New York and London. Eric James was a significant figure in Trinidad, both the chief accountant of the Trinidad Railways, a job for which he'd already received an MBE from the Queen, and secretary of the Trinidad Football Association. Even though it was late in the evening, Eric took his brother straight to their father's house in Tunapuna. C.L.R. described the reunion in a letter to Lyman Payne soon afterwards. We went down to the old man that night and reached there at about 2 o'clock. He was very glad to see me and I was glad to see him. He said, well, it's a long time. And he practically said that he didn't think he would see me. But there I was. We had a big meal. He had a bottle of champagne. And it's very difficult for him to be up so late. Perhaps a surprise, perhaps not, was his discovery that Robert James, the original old man, was still working. He lives in a good house, a house he built when he retired. He has a school of some nearly 60 pupils to whom he gives commercial lessons, and they sit for the English examination and pass. They come to him from all parts of the neighbourhood, some of them 20 miles away. He has to turn some back. He is, however, quite old. He was 81 on July 15th, and the strain on him is very great. But he can't help it. He must continue with the school because that's what he lives by. There are obvious resemblances between father and son. Like C.L.R., Robert seems to go up and down in mood and health, and like C.L.R., he had a much younger female helper. He took a turn towards real old age about a year or two ago, and when he goes out now, he has to go with a stick. But his mind is still as lively as ever. He talks by the yard to me, telling me all the old stories and a whole heap of new ones. The other day, he picked up himself and went off to the races with his assistant. She's a young woman of about 30 whom he taught, and she became an assistant after she passed her examinations. She's been with him for 14 years. The other person who had been with Robert since his wife Bessie died, also 14 years earlier, was C.L.R.'s sister Olive. C.L.R. was quickly aware that of the three siblings, she had drawn the short straw. Olive is a wonderful person. She is 56 and her life has been spent first of all nursing my mother when she was struck down with a stroke, and afterwards taking care of my father. She's an old maid, but she has very few of the characteristics of an old maid. She dresses herself very well, and she has a good head. You will pardon me if I quote someone as saying that Olive has the James brain. When I left here, she took little interest in politics. Now she's as acute in analysis and as capable in gathering up information about the general political situation and the situation in her own neighbourhood as anybody I've met. She and my father, I regret to say, are reactionaries both. They are on the opposite party, though they deny it. I would win over Olive without a doubt because she has always believed that I am the most wonderful brother in the world. And now I have come back, we start off exactly where we left off. But the essential thing about Olive is that she's a good woman, a fine person, recognized as such by anybody who knows her. There is nothing mean or cheap about her, and her general responses to things and her sentiments are practically always fine. That is despite the hard life she's lived. I hope to goodness I shall be able to give her a trip to England. My father says that he will give her the money to go any time. But of course he says that, but he will be very put out if Olive left him, though he makes a great show. And I'm afraid he persecutes Olive quite a lot. That, however, is by the way. At 81, he is entitled to his idiosyncrasies.
Yeah, and I mean, the nature of that passage and what James is actually saying brings the inevitable question, which runs throughout the biography, of your position on James's gender politics. And I'm talking about the relationships that he sees within his family, his interaction with his assistants, his relationship with his the woman who he did fabulous intellectual work with over the years, and his own personal relationships. Based on what your research uncovered, what kind of comment do you want to make there?
Wow. It's a complex subject, as most people's relationships to the opposite sex probably are, if one's honest. But I would say one thing is he certainly talks a good game, and I think in his writings, right back to the beginning, his first short stories and his first novel, Minty Alley, his portrayal of the women in the barrack yards are extraordinarily sensitive and empathetic. I think you can see that he's a man who loves women and takes women seriously. And I think that carries through, in his political life. He consistently worked with strong, brilliant women. In New York, his closest associates were Raya Dunayevskaya and Grace Lee Boggs, who were both, very strong women. And he absolutely, gave them their head. There was no sense that, he pulled rank as the man in the group. And right through, till in his 70s and 80s, when his role was much more as a teacher and lecturer than as a writer. Really, he was very impressed by the wave of feminism of the 70s. Particularly, he was excited by the new wave of Black American women writers, Alice Walker in particular, also Toni Morrison, and Zaki Shangi, I think, was a particular favorite. So yeah, I think, and his politics, his political views always saw the revolutionary potential of women, none more so than in the work of his third wife, Selma James, who he encouraged to write about the lives of working class women, for the Trotskyist group. So to that extent, I would say, you'd give him, he was exceptionally ahead of his time in his feminism. In his private life, he didn't always live up to those standards. I think he liked to present himself as a sort of a very buttoned up English sort of person, but the reality was he was something of a womanizer, really. I mean, to put that in context, one should say that he was an extraordinarily, tall, good-looking man, extraordinarily charming. I'm sure that there were any number of women who were very attracted to him. And, it's easy to criticize people's womanizing if you're not actually having to fight people off on a daily basis. So, that said, there are one or two instances that crop up in the book where I think he became to take it almost for granted that any woman he met would fancy him, and that there's at least one occasion documented in the book where he went over the line, really, and in a way that I'm sure he knew at the time was wrong. And certainly in he left his first wife in Trinidad when his work took him to England. He left his second wife, Constance, when they'd been married for 2 years and had a baby son, and he left her for another woman. So it's he had, and during his third marriage, he had affairs as well. So yeah, I would say in his writings, absolutely great. In his personal life, like many of us, maybe he didn't live up to all the standards he set himself.
I mean, I think that there is a longer story that we can't explore right now on James and his encounter with questions of gender in the 1950s. Partly also because there are some very prominent Black woman feminists who are in the United States and who are in radical circles at that time that whose work he basically does not engage with and ignores on some level. Then part of that, of course, is Trotskyist Communist Party politics, and it's complicated, and there are many other things we could say there. But I want to return back to this question of the Caribbean and the impact of James on a Caribbean intelligentsia, because I think it's one thing that you mention, but perhaps it's not played right through in the book. You certainly speak about Norman Manley and the remarkable exchanges that they have, but I don't recall seeing as much about James's lectures at the University of the West Indies campuses, and thinking about that relationship then, and that mentorship he had with figures like, let's say, Norman Gurvan, Walter Rodney, yes, certainly, but also figures like Norman Gurvan, Lloyd Best, particularly thinking about that Trinidadian context and what that actually meant for another generation of Caribbean intellectuals who certainly are going to be very prominent from the 1980s into about the first or even the beginning of second decade of this unsettled 21st century.
Yeah. To be honest, I partly put my hand up here and saying, that it's, I mean, obviously there are, you can't get everything into a biography, but I was aware that there was more there, that I haven't covered that, that period in as much depth as I would ideally have liked to. I talk a bit about, after he was basically, cut a long story short, he fell out with Williams in the early 60s. He came back to London. And at that point, he started a kind of study circle at his home in London with a lot of young Caribbean students, including people you've just mentioned, and that was inspirational and important. He was really giving them kind of seminars on revolutionary Marxism, which I think, made a huge impact. And he would carry that through, as you say, into his lectures later on in the Caribbean. I don't really talk about that so much. I talk a little bit about his talk. But he comes back to Trinidad and starts the Workers' and Farmers' Party in 1965, where he makes his one slightly disastrous attempt to be an actual political figure, to put himself up for election. And that didn't work well. And I think he realized that he was essentially, apart from anything else, just too old to really cut it as a politician on the stump in Trinidad. So, and he literally went from failing that election to going to Canada, to the big, assemblage of Black revolutionary thinkers. And I think at that point he realized that teaching, his job now was to inspire the next generation, that he could no longer see himself as being in the forefront, that he needed to take a back seat, but make sure that the new generation, were informed by all that he'd learned in his, in his 60 years at that point.
Indeed. Yeah. And I think that there's an immense amount covered in the biography, and certainly one can't cover all. But that actually raises a question for me. And I'm moving towards also a conclusion now, given the time. But what's your hope for audience for this book? And also, could you reflect further on to me? Is this going to be the end of your writings on James? And if so, what are your new future projects that you hope to engage with?
Okay.
So intended audience and future projects.
Right. Well, I just think James is a fascinating character, and everyone should see that he has something to offer. Anyone who's interested in the state of the world, which I hope is really everyone. I think that his life, what I hope the biography does, on one level, is simply to tell a really quite an exciting story, but also to make you think about what can you do with your life. He never allowed himself to be limited at any point by what people might expect of someone like him. He hits London in the 1930s and he absolutely takes it by storm. his self-confidence is extraordinary and inspiring. So I would hope that this is a book that will appeal to people, let's be realistic, people who maybe heard the name C.L.R. James, but maybe have an image of a kind of white-haired sage in their minds, but that's essentially it. I think this is a book that will tell them there's so much more to him and make you think about wherever you're from, really, what you can be, what you can do, in a way, what is a life for? And I think James's life asks you that question again and again. So, yeah, that's what I hope. In terms of what I'm writing, after our biography, I'm slightly decompressing. I've just started writing a comic novel set in a radical bookshop in London in the 1980s. Who knows where it'll go, but it's nice to get back into fiction. And I'm considering writing a book about Paul Robeson's time in exile in England in the late 50s and early 60s, which is quite it's a strange, in some ways sad, in other ways inspiring story that I don't feel has been told again. And I'm starting to think about that and to think whether I really want to spend several years in that story or not. We'll see.
That's always a question. Can you actually maintain your interest in the story enough? And I can tell that James, of course, is a topic who has maintained your interest for a good 30 odd years or so. And I think it's fantastic that we have this biography available. So I'd like to move towards a conclusion by saying, John, thank you so much for your time here and for this biography, which has given us so much to ponder. And thanks to all of you, our audience, for attending this session of the NGC Bocas Literary Festival, our opening evening. And please do continue to come to our sessions over the course of this festival. So thank you and good evening.
Thanks.